The Executive's Executioner is the 21st episode of the third season of Cheers, directed by the wonderful James Burrows, and this one focuses quite heavily on Norm, and Norm being my favourite character, that made me rather happy. So, as always, I will go through the narrative in quite a bit of detail, so there will be spoilers from this point on. And the first thing I want to mention is that this is another episode without Coach, and I also think this is the first time Coach wasn't mentioned. I don't believe Coach was mentioned, which is not a happy thought. But other than that, the rest of the episode is great. So I will go through things pretty much chronologically. And the intro is fine. It's not one of my favorites. Carla's being sarcastic about thanking a punter for a quarter tip. Not the most interesting intro, but not too bad at all. And then we learn about the subplot involving Cliff and his new neighbours. Some neighbours have moved next door to Cliff and his mother. They're really noisy. We circle back to this narrative a little later on. It's not too bad. I like Cliff, but again, it's part of the narrative that definitely felt like filler more than anything else. But it did give us quite a few opportunities for Carla to say some pretty mean things to Cliff, which I have a love-hate relationship with because they're clever and funny, but I also really love Cliff. But we'll come back to that part of the narrative a little later on. Then the main narrative with Norm kicks in. His boss comes into the bar. Norm runs into the men's room to hide, and he's hiding, kind of crouching on top of a toilet. And his boss comes in and tells him that actually they want him to become the corporate killer and be the person who tells people they're being fired. It's a very interesting scene because, first of all, I don't think that's the way any of us expected it to go. And also, there's a lot of graffiti in the men's room, and some of it I couldn't read, some of it I couldn't quite, make out. But some of it we have. There's one that says Deo for some reason, and one saying it's not easy being good looking. If you were able to read any of the other graffiti, please do let me know what it says, as I thought that was pretty good fun. So then Norm has to take on this new role of being the person who tells people they're being fired. And as with other parts of this episode, I don't think this goes the way anybody would expect. The first person is a character called Billy Richter, played by Mark Schubb. And he's just put a down payment on a house. His wife is pregnant. Norm is really not wanting to do this. And he brings them into Cheers to do this. So obviously that's how we get to see it. And he starts crying and breaking down, and he's struggling with it more than the people he's firing. And his name becomes, well, synonymous with this, and every time he speaks to somebody, they think he's going to fire them, and this plays out a little later on. But first, we do circle back to Cliff and Carla in quite an interesting moment. Carla takes it upon herself to write a rather nasty letter, technically on Cliff's behalf, to these new neighbours to get them to stop being annoying. And obviously she's doing that because she wants to write a nasty letter, but it's a moment of bonding between the two of them. It's Carla doing something for Cliff, even though she's obviously doing it for her own personal gain. It was quite nice and quite sweet and a little rare moment of bonding between the two of them. Then of course Cliff fights with the mail carrier and well, things don't necessarily go his way. Then we go back to Norm, and the rest of the episode focuses on Norm. And there's this, again, a really unexpected moment where Norm is sleeping in Cheers, and he wakes up and just screams. And then we find out he was dreaming, and he tells us about this dream, and we see it unfolding on screen. Normally, I don't care about dream sequences, I don't care about seeing dreams in films. There are exceptions in films and TV shows, but this one was just, it's so unusual for Cheers to give us this kind of scene that I actually didn't mind it. And the dream is Norm standing in front of an elevator with a row of accountants or a queue of accountants, and he's pushing them into the elevator one by one, and it's all misty and foggy and rather effective. And it's not bad. If it's something Cheers did a lot, it would get annoying. But as an occasional one time really thing, it was quite different, and I quite liked it. And then John comes into the bar, a character played by Warren Munson. Norm is supposed to fire him, and all of a sudden, Norm can't produce tears. It's not emotional for him anymore. Not that he likes doing it, but he's kind of become desensitized to this process, and that's not a good thing. So he decides to, well, first of all, he decides to fake cry, which is brilliant. George Wendt gave an amazing performance in this episode, as is always the case, of course. And he decides to quit because he can't do this anymore. So he phones up Mr. Simpson in person now. As soon as he hears his name, he screams and hangs up. So he phones his secretary, Mr. Simpson's secretary. They scream and hang up. And then he tries to phone Mr. Hecht and go straight to the root of this problem. And then the episode ends with George Wendt just giving this evil laugh. It's just brilliant. It's a very different Cheers episode in a lot of ways. And I also think it's a very unpredictable episode, and I really thoroughly enjoyed it. I love Norm. It's a really brilliant Norm episode. The story with Cliff is absolutely fine, and as I said, we get a really nice moment between Cliff and Carla, but Norm, for me, is obviously the star of the show, and I'll always love him. And this episode is a pretty good Norm episode, very well written, a few surprises throughout it, and ultimately a really enjoyable watch.